So this is our final lecture on the age of imperialism. We're mostly talking about imperialism in Asia, in China, and Japan. So the first we want to talk about are patterns of intrusion of the Western Europeans going into China. China, since we last left China with Zheng He, the Ming Dynasty kind of has a very self-sufficient culture. Sent out those expeditions, the seven expeditions of Zheng He, and they really didn't find anything of note until they really, as we described, turned inwards on themselves. The Ming are going to be taken over by the Yuans from the north, and so they're going to kind of going from there, and they're going to be kind of rolling around for about a couple hundred different centuries here. As we move into the Manchu dynasty, China's been kind of running itself, and the leaders of the Manchu dynasty really only stay in the capital city, so they really don't start to notice the crumbling and the tearing apart on the edges of society begins to kind of moves from there. And it's at this point, as we turn into the 1800s, is when the Europeans start to take more and more of an interest in Chinese products and China itself. What we can say is that prior to the Europeans really diving headfirst into China, is that by the 1800s, China itself is a society and economy in decline and is running into lots of different problems. And it's at just that point that the British show up. The British begin showing up in China along with a lot of other Europeans for one of the biggest of China's exports of tea. And they really like that. Think about the British sending out entire time of the day, tea time, for that. And the British also love Ming vases and silks and all this wonderful stuff. China doesn't really need any of the things that Britain's offering. Doesn't need cuckoo clocks. It doesn't need any of the things that it's saying. And so Britain begins to look at its treasury as the money begins to dwindle and dwindle and dwindle lower and lower and lower as it gets shipped to China through Macau, Canton, and Hong Kong, and Britain has nothing really to show for it other than tea that's being guzzled down by the millions of gallons. So Britain tries to look throughout its empire, and the one thing they do find that the Chinese really like is opium. Opium is coming out of India, and people in India have been using opium, for a very long time for a wide variety of different maladies. Now, as you probably are aware, one of the great things about being a seller of opium is that it's highly addictive. And so, what the British begin to find is that they can take opium from India, bring it to China, and the Chinese will buy a whole heck of a lot of it. And so what the British are trying to do is try to fix that, what they believe is an imbalance of trade of all the silver flooding to China to buy Chinese tea. Well, the British begin to get more of that silver back from China by selling it this little drug. The Chinese don't like this. And as you can probably imagine, the leaders of China and people in China are saying, no, we don't want this drug, this garbage, this horrible thing, right, causing all sorts of problems. The Chinese send a commissioner from the capital, Lin Zexu, right, and he goes to where the British are dealing in their opium, and he seizes a whole heck of a lot of it and sets it on fire and declares we don't want it. Even writes a letter to Queen Victoria saying stop this or drastic measures like this destruction will take place. Britain sees a large fortune literally go up in flames, wash down rivers, and so they won't stand for that. And so the British, right, begin in 1839 what comes to be known as the First Opium War. And they show up with their cannons and their frigates and their guns, and they begin to attack Chinese and begin to do that. As you probably can imagine, the winner of the First Opium War are the British. What the British do at the conclusion of the First Opium War is force China, literally at gunpoint, to sign the Treaty of Nanjing. What the Treaty of Nanjing does is it forces China to give British access to four other ports. All right, up until this point, they really only had to trade in one small area in Canton. This opens up more of the Chinese economy, more of the Chinese people to British imports, and also gave the island of Hong Kong to China, which Britain is going to hang on to until 1999. And there's a whole James Bond movie that talks about that from there. It's a big thing. It's one of the reasons why right now here in 2020, Hong Kong and China don't give a lot because again, Hong Kong's going to be ruled by the British for, I mean, close to 150 years. The British, as they take more and more ports and open them up to Chinese trading. It's like this. And so in 1856, a second Opium War is fought to the same conclusion. China is forced to open up even more ports to the Europeans as even more and more opium pours into the country. This leads to the people in China being very upset about this. And so we see in the later 1800s what's called the Taiping Rebellion. And this is a rebellion of Chinese people themselves against the Qing Manchu foreign leaders in Beijing, against the French who are there, against the British and other Europeans who they were there. This is going to result in at least 20 million deaths, mostly from starvation, as a bunch of Chinese warlords are kind of fighting out amongst each other to the detriment of the Chinese people there, and it's going to cause all sorts of different problems. Is they're leading, trying to again fight for their own nationalism, their own independence out of this. So lots of stuff to talk about here with the Opium War. We're going to start here with China closed off most of its trading to Europeans. Right? They forced the Europeans only to come to one small port right, at Canton. And as you can see, there's just a few small amount of trading ports. And with these little factories, one for Denmark, one for Portugal, one for the United States, one for Sweden, one for Britain, one for France, right? The Americans will be able to unload their supplies, gather all the stuff they wanted from the Chinese, and then be able to send back. But that's the only place they could set foot in China at all. And any other place would again subject to death and all other things. And so that's one of the small sticking points is that they want to do more trade with the Chinese other than in these one little spots right here. And so that's a bigger point with the British. They're going from there because again, what do the British want? Is this early 1900s picture shows they want tea. You can see the Chinese workers here literally stacked with on stacks and stacks and stacks in the back here with all the tea leaves being taken out of China, being brought there and signed over. So you have all the silver flowing into China from Britain, all this tea flowing out, and the British are looking at their pocketbooks and seeing it ever smaller and smaller and smaller. They decide they're going to sell opium to China. And so the opium business, all right, starts off very small. The unit of opium that's being sold was called a chest, and each chest of opium contained over 140 pounds. And as this opium trade begins in the late 1700s, all right, in 1773, it begins with over 1,000 chests of opium. And again, you take 1,000 times 140, you can start to see how many pounds this is. And again, you don't need a very large amount of opium to start feeling pretty good about yourself as we begin to move into at the time the first opium war begins. 40,000 chests of opium are being smuggled into China. And then again, as we move past the second opium war, at its peak, over 81,000 chests of opium of 140 pounds in each chest is being brought into China, and it's just causing all sorts of problems. And so you can kind of see in India, well, just we're not going to describe the whole process, but it's a pretty labor-intensive process to be able to go and make opium in and of itself from there. Well, opium comes from the poppy seed plant, and what in order to be able to harvest it, you have to wait to just the right time in order to be able to do that, right? And it's a specific type of opium from there. You have to wait till just after the petals of the poppy plant have fallen, but not before the pod itself is fully ripe. And then workers would go through a field and take very extraordinarily small and extraordinarily sharp knives to be able to make incisions, right? Small little cuts on the side of the poppy. And what would come out, right, would be this ooze. And this ooze, this gum, right, they would let harden overnight and then it'd be quick to go and collect it the next morning. And then if they turned it the next day, they would go through there and go from there. And they're again in these small, tiny amounts, these droplets that they're scraping off. About an acre of poppies would give you about 56, I think 56 pounds of opium is what the book says here. And so that's what they're doing. They're then taking this and then being able to go and put it into these big, huge, giant, quote unquote, factories here in India. And we want to really emphasize just how big these buildings are. You can start to see the scale of what's required in order to be able to do this. So the opiums then laid out are it's dried out, and again, it's then scraped and other stuff to kind of move it all out to dry out all the extra moisture to just rest with the raw opium itself. This then was rolled by hand rollers, all right, into balls, right? From there, and again, you can see the kids who are then picking it up, and again, those are kids who got raw opium on their hands who are then poking their eyeballs and licking their fingers and picking their nose. So those kids are feeling pretty good, right, by the time their shift's over. But again, they're being addicted to this, and you can see just how far back, right, this goes. The balls are then put into a different room, and they're all dried and moved around. Again, on the size here, and then they're put from there into giant pots, and then those pots, and again, you can see just how high up they're going in here as they're stacked, dried out even more. They're put on these big, huge, giant clipper ships with big, huge sails to sail as fast as they can in these big fleets sailing out of India to, at the very beginning, just Canton and then later Macau in China. Opium was illegal in China, and so you couldn't do any business with opium on the mainland itself anywhere. And so Chinese merchants would have to sail out into the water, meet the ships there, and that's where they would do their business transactions of paying the silver for the opium, where it's then brought in there. And it's at that point in 1839 when Lin Zhu says no more. And this is the commissioner who's brought down from there to put a stop to this practice, to stop this horrible drug from getting into China and causing further social, political, economic problems in there. And so what he does is, again, after telling Queen Elizabeth there on the left in a letter, or Queen Victoria, what he's going to do is goes and destroys it, right? Buries it, sets it on fire, and gets rid of it. And that's what sets off the British. Chinese do not want, right, more of what eventually Westerns are called opium eaters, people who are going and taking this and smoking the opium and going from there. Do this. This is a picture I took at the Field Museum in Chicago. Again, just showing what a typical of things. But again, it causes you to be very, very relaxed, as you probably can imagine, where you don't want to do anything else. And because it's addictive, all you really worried about is getting the next hit of opium. And again, you don't worry about eating, you don't worry about sleeping, and it causes all sorts of different problems. As again, you're only worried about where you're going to get your next hit of opium. So it causes all sorts of stuff from there as the British are going doing this. So once that ship is destroyed, the British are upset and they go and they send in the British fleet. Right? The Second Opium War has the greatly named HMS Nemesis show up there with its iron armor on its outside of it, and pretty much all the Chinese cannonballs just bounce off, and so it's pretty much able to do whatever it wants because of again its technological superiority from there. So it's pretty easy for the British to work their way through China in the first Opium War and the second Opium War to literally blast open more ports for British businessmen to do their business in. China, by this point, right, is inundated with an opium epidemic, is being attacked by the British as other things from there. It's to the point in 1894 that the Sino-Japanese War takes place, the Chinese-Japanese War, and Japan begins to carve territory away out of China for itself as it begins to take its own first colonies in Korea and other places. It's at this point, after Japan's defeat of China and Japan's victory over that and carving it there, that the Western European nations begin to turn from Africa to China and start licking their lips. They start to begin saying, if the Japanese can take parts of China for themselves, well, we can just go and carve this all up. So the Western Europeans begin to go look at China the same way they looked at kind of the great big pizza pie that was Africa. And they already start sharpening their swords and getting their pizza wheels ready, carving up their own slice of China to be able to divide it up amongst themselves from there. And China is about to be carved up when the United States steps in. And the Secretary of State for the United for President Theodore Roosevelt is Secretary of State John Hay, and he proposes the U.S. open door policy to China. China and the United States have been best buddies, all right, for a very long time, going back before the United States even existed. And so Hay and Roosevelt in the United States are trying to prevent what happened in Africa to the Chinese. And so the U.S. open door policy opposes Chinese territory annexation. Instead, what the United States says, instead of carving out literal territories of China, the Europeans can have what they call spheres of influence. And this is an area in which a foreign nation would control all the trade and investment in one small area of China, well, bigger area, but none of the other Europeans can go in there. So China still owned all that territory, but they could only trade in once in Tsingtao in the north with the Germans, right? In Shanghai, right? In Hong Kong with the British, and you get the pictures going from there. So this is what keeps China from being carved up, just like we saw with Africa in a previous lecture. As we then begin to move into the late 1800s, right? As the century turns to the 20th century, the Chinese are looking around and saying, we don't like this. There's a drug that's causing all sorts of problems in opium. The Europeans are taking liberties with owning all this other stuff, and so we don't like that. And so this threat of foreigners all throughout China and those foreigners taking control of China leads to a development called the Boxer Rebellion. And this is a Chinese traditionalist revolt. These are a group of people whose goal it was to drive the foreigners out of China. They don't like how the foreigners are ruling for the Chinese and other stuff, and they want again these feelings of nationalism that we've been talking about for a couple units now. They want to have Chinese being ruled by the Chinese, and they want to drive the foreigners out. Now the Boxers are named that way because it breeds out of a kind of a quote unquote secret society called the Rights of the Harmonious Fist, with a big giant upraised closed fist as part of their banner, and with the Chinese practicing martial arts, the Christian missionaries in there who have no idea what kung fu is at this point are calling them boxers because that's the closest kind of cultural connection they can make, and so that's where their term comes from there. So the Boxers begin to go and carve out territories for themselves. They begin to drive foreigners out. They go and they siege control of Beijing. It's at that point, along with the murder of a couple foreign leaders in Beijing, that the rest of the world decides they're going to stop this. 19,000 foreign troops from a giant coalition of nations, right, are called to Beijing to rescue those workers, to drive out the Boxers, and put this revolt down. We see with the end of this that the Chinese political structure begins to go and all fall apart, and by 1912, the Manchu dynasty ends. A new constitution modeled on the United States is written, and this is how China is going to be governed very closely with the United States up until uh, the communist revolution of Mao Zedong following World War II. And again, it gets a little murky in there, but that's how that's going that way. So at the conclusion of the Sino-Japanese War, the Europeans, modeled like in this GIF here from The Simpsons of Mr. Burns' dad, begin to look around and say, hey, if the Japanese can beat the Chinese, we're Europeans, we're quote unquote better, we're quote unquote superior, we're quote unquote do all this other stuff. We can go and we can carve China up for ourselves. And so they begin to go and look around, begin to lick their lips, begin to see that China is knocked out and is ready to be carved up all amongst themselves. Now, this map is nothing that ever existed. This is a proposed map, but again, you start to get the idea of this is how China is going to start looking if nobody steps in to this point because everybody wants to go from themselves. The Europeans are looking to go and take and carve all it up, and that's when the United States begins to pipe up and say, "Hey, well, we are a little bit imperialistic of ourselves, but you guys are being much worse, and so we don't want that to happen." So they step in with their open door notes and they turn in these spheres of influence for China. Um, these are the boxers. This is one of the few non-stage pictures of them. So again, regular Chinese as they're going and moving and trying to fight their way out of there. Again, the boxers are their goal is to drive the foreigners out of China. They're going and using at first theaters and speakers and letters to try to show how bad the foreigners are and how superior the Chinese are to be able to go from there. You can see the pig representing the Christians. There's an anti-Christian movement as well, so they don't like the missionaries going throughout China too. So they begin to do that. Where do they attack the Europeans? Well, they attack them one in their industry. Right here, they're prying up the railroads from there. As again, they're about to attack this railroad track, and they begin to mourn the murder, right, foreigners, right, in the cities as well. And so the Europeans won't stand for this, and so the Boxer Rebellion and that has to be fought between them. We see about 10 different nations. Right, in this one, we have Britain, United States, Australia, India, Germany, France, Austria-Hungary, Italy, and Japan, all sending soldiers as kind of this early united action to be able to go into China, put down all these, march into Beijing, the foreign city where the emperor lives, and be able to go and put all this down as they're going and fighting all this stuff up. As again they're doing this, right? The Europeans say, well, we're putting all this investment in here, we're trying to stop this, and it's the United States that says no, stop. That they want to make China an open door, that everybody should be able to trade with China and not just be able to go and carve it all up from there. What's the motivation for the United States? His Uncle Stan wants to bring what? He wants to bring civilization, progress, cotton, railroads, education, dry goods, trains to China, who have 400 million barbarians, according to this cartoon. And someone's going to have to go and give. And you probably can tell on the business end of that gun, it's not going to be the United States. To finish up, we want to talk about Japan. And Japan, as we left Japan with the fall of with the beginning of the daimyo and the shogunates, right, are very much isolationists. They don't allow anybody onto the island. There's only small amounts of trade with Europeans on small little islands. So they're very isolationist from the rest of the world, and they're very keen on preserving the traditions. And unlike the Chinese or the Indians or other peoples of Eastern Europe, they're going to be able to do that until 1853. And that's when U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry arrives with a four-ship fleet. He sails right into Tokyo Bay. He lines up his ships broadside with their cannons loaded and tells the Japanese either open up for trade or we're going to blow you up. He even blows up a couple of smaller buildings along the edge of the harbor just to show that he means business. And it's at the business end of these cannons and guns that Japan really is brought into the 1800s. And so, really, overnight, Japan transforms. After 1858, Japan has a crisis of identity, and they begin to say, well, either we turn out like the Chinese, right, and have everybody take advantage of us, or like the Indians, or we look at the Europeans and try their model. And so we see with the Japanese losing many of their traditions, right, to Western ways. They begin to build up their military in the quote unquote Western style. And they have military advisors from Prussia, from England, from the United States come in to kind of change their military from the old samurai shogun ways into your stereotypical British thing. And this is kind of the plot of the movie The Last Samurai of Tom Cruise. Right? That kind of goes and works its way into this as well. This is what's called the Meiji Restoration. This is a time period in Japanese history where the Meiji Emperor is restored to the throne, but it's a way a way to kind of talk about the modernization, industrialization, and westernization of Japan during this time period, and all by from there. Very quickly, Japan industrializes in the Western way, takes their military, and then, as we saw, begins to use that military like the Western Europeans do, going into China in the Sino-Japanese War and carving out areas of there as it begins to lay claim to other parts along the Pacific shoreline of Asia. It runs into conflict with Russia. And in 1904, the Russians and the Japanese fight the Russo-Japanese War. And to the surprise of all the Europeans, Japan wins. And it's this victory over the Russians, over the quote unquote superior Europeans, right, that really highlights the military and naval strength of Japan to the Japanese themselves. Say, hey, we're on the right track. We can do this and we can go and we can start building our own empire ourselves. Back in Europe, this is really going to shock the Europeans and the United States, and they're really going to start to say, hey, this is imperialism is kind of our game. We don't want these Japanese doing it as well. So this Japanese imperialism begins really in the Sino-Japanese War in the last decade of the 1800s, but into the early 1900s and all the way through, I mean, December 7th, 1941. So Japanese imperialism is all about, again, trying to ape what the Western Europeans, the United States is doing. The first colony Japan takes is Korea, the Korean Peninsula, and then they begin to take the island of Taiwan, and then begin to move in Manchuria. What the Japanese are trying to do is look to overcome a lack of natural resources that they want, right, that they have in Japan that they don't have there. And so they need oil and rubber and steel and iron, all the natural resources of a industrial state they don't have in Japan, or they don't have enough of it, so they need to go and, like the Europeans did, and take it from someplace else. And the people of Western Europe are not going to be happy about that. So to finish up, we have some pictures for you. So that's a picture of Commodore Matthew Perry on the left, and that's a drawing from the Japanese view of him as he kind of shows up from there. So again, uh, visualizingcultures.mit.edu website does a very good job of showing how the Europeans view the Asian people they're coming in contact with, and more importantly, how these Asian people view the Europeans coming in. As the U.S. Japan fleet here shows up in Tokyo Bay, right? The Japanese view of, right, kind of in a much different literal light, right, than what the Americans are kind of doing, is they're showing all the different people show up and what they're bringing, including a little model railroad, right, to there, really do that. So Japan very quickly after Perry shows up begins to modernize, westernize, industrialize, begins to go and take on the Japanese, the Russians. We really begin to see a little Western European country develop in Japan as they begin to modernize with trains, as their women adopt Western dress, and they begin to build things that would not be out of place in the United States or in Europe and England at this point, to be able, more importantly, to take their military, which they believe is their greatest strength, and be able to take that kind of samurai Bushido ethos and apply it to Western military styles. Where we're going to kind of leave Japan here at the end of this unit is Japan begins to expand its empire over into Korea, Taiwan, right, into Manchuria, taking stuff away from Russia as it begins a search for natural resources, right, to be able to go and take more stuff. And as it begins to grow bigger and bigger and bigger westward, it's going to run into another country, the United States, which is going to be a story for another day.